No one expected the feed to go live. There had been no signal warning, no procedural announcement, no transition into broadcast protocol. One moment the chamber of the arbitration citadel was sealed in its usual controlled quiet, tiers of alien delegations suspended in ordered gravity rings, observers behind polarized glass, the neutral arbitration core glowing at the center, and the next, every surface ignited with light. Not ceremonial light. Not diplomatic display. Raw transmission. Across 1,000 systems, the galaxy began to watch. Commander Ilya Voss knew it before anyone said it out loud. He didn't look at the screens first. He looked at the ceiling, where a thin line of amber indicators had shifted from local to interstellar relay. It was a detail most delegates would never notice. But humans had helped calibrate those systems years ago, back when cooperation still meant something. Back when trust had not yet been weaponized. By the time he lowered his gaze, it was already too late. Earth filled the chamber, not the Earth anyone here had ever been shown. Not the carefully curated entry briefings, not the collaborative achievements, not the decades of cautious integration that had earned humanity a seat in this very room. No, what spread across the towering displays was something else entirely. Cities burning in sequences cut too precisely to be accidental. Oceans choked with debris from centuries ago. Conflict after conflict layered without context, without recovery, without resolution. Every failure, every fracture, every moment humanity had nearly destroyed itself, compressed, sharpened, and presented as a continuous identity. There was no narration at first. That made it worse. Silence forced interpretation. Silence let the images speak as verdict. A murmur rippled through the chamber, not loud, not chaotic, but dense. The sound of hundreds of species recalibrating their assumptions in real time. Some leaned forward. Some remained perfectly still. Some, Ilya noticed, did not look surprised at all. That was the first anomaly. The second came when the central dais activated. High Curator Thel did not rush. The being unfolded into the light with the kind of deliberate precision that came from long familiarity with power. Their form was elongated, layered in shifting plates that reflected the broadcast glow in fractured colors, their voice resonating not through air but through the chamber's structural field itself. This, Thel said, calm and measured, is a historical transparency demonstration. The phrase landed with surgical clarity. Not accusation. Not condemnation. Something colder. Something procedural. Ilya felt the weight of that wording settle in his mind even as the images continued to cycle. Transparency implied necessity. Demonstration implied proof. It reframed the entire spectacle as obligation rather than choice. Clever. Too clever. Thel continued, outlining risk factors, behavioral instability models, predictive conflict projections, all anchored to the curated stream unfolding behind them. Every statement technically grounded. Every conclusion just slightly overstretched. Not enough to be false. Just enough to guide interpretation. The chamber wasn't being informed. It was being steered. And now, every civilization watching beyond these walls was being steered with it. Ilya did not move. Around him, the human delegation remained silent. Some had gone rigid. One had started to reach for a console before stopping halfway, as if realizing too late that any reaction would already be part of the narrative being built. Because that was the trap, wasn't it? React, and you confirm instability. Protest, and you validate defensiveness. Stay silent, and you let the story stand. For a moment, a very small moment, Ilya allowed himself to feel it. The pressure. Not fear. Not exactly anger. Something sharper. The awareness of being reduced. Not attacked openly, but positioned. Defined. Managed. His gaze shifted, not to the screens, not to Thel, but to the outer ring of delegates. And there it was again. Recognition. Not in all of them, but enough. Enough to understand this wasn't a spontaneous evaluation. This had been built. Coordinated. Someone had decided humanity's place in the galaxy would be set tonight. And they had chosen humiliation as the mechanism. Thel's voice softened, just slightly as the final sequence slowed. A calculated deceleration, giving the audience time to absorb, to settle into the conclusion already forming. The arbitration citadel recognizes the presence of the human delegation, Fell said. We invite acknowledgement of the presented record. Acknowledgement, not response, not defense. Acknowledgement meant agreement without saying the word. The chamber went still. Hundreds of eyes, some literal, some abstract, some embedded in sensor arrays, shifted toward a single point, the Voss. He stood. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just enough to feel deliberate. The walk to the central platform had been rehearsed in 100 different contexts over the years. Ceremonies. Negotiations. Deadlocks. Always controlled. Always measured. This time, something was different. Not in his posture. In the silence behind him. No whispers from his own team. No last-second data streams. No desperate recalculations. It was as if, for the first time since humanity had entered this system, there was nothing left to prepare. Only a choice. He reached the platform and rested his hand lightly against its edge, feeling the faint vibration of the broadcast field humming through it. Every system was still watching. Every species still processing. He could feel the expectation. Apologize. Explain. Submit. That was the script. That was always the script. Ilya looked up at the towering displays one last time as another sequence looped. Another carefully selected fragment of human failure frozen in perfect clarity. Then he did something no one in that chamber had predicted. He reached out and powered the display down. Not the entire broadcast. Not the external feed. Just the local projection. The chamber lights shifted instantly, the sudden absence of imagery leaving a void that felt louder than anything that had come before. Gasps, real ones this time, rippled outward. Fell didn't move. That was interesting. Ilya let the silence stretch. Long enough to become uncomfortable. Long enough for every observer to realize that something had just broken, but not in the way they expected. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. We've seen enough. No defense. No argument. No denial. Just that. Then he stepped back, turned, and walked out of the chamber. No escort. No urgency. No hesitation. Behind him, the broadcast continued to stream to the galaxy, uninterrupted, unchanged, still telling its story. But inside the Citadel, something had shifted. Because humanity hadn't argued. They hadn't submitted. They hadn't even tried to correct the record. They had simply refused to participate. And as the doors sealed behind Ilya Voss with a quiet, final sound, one question began to spread, first through the chamber, then outward across the watching systems, faster than the broadcast itself. If humanity wasn't defending itself, then what exactly had they just decided to do instead? The corridor outside the chamber was silent in a way that felt engineered. Not the natural quiet of an empty space, but the controlled absence of interruption. The arbitration citadel did not allow disorder to bleed into its structural pathways. Every sound, every movement, every signal was filtered, moderated, smooth. Even crisis here was supposed to remain elegant. Ilya Voss walked through that silence without breaking stride. Behind him, the broadcast still pulsed across the galaxy. Inside the chamber, the narrative continued to unfold exactly as intended, humanity reduced to a curated sequence of failure. From the outside, it would appear as though the human envoy had walked away because there was nothing left to say. From the inside, that illusion was holding, for now. The moment the chamber doors sealed, Ilya raised his hand. Not dramatically. Not urgently. Just enough for the implant at his wrist to shift from passive monitoring to secure channel authority. Seal internal relay, he said. The response came instantly, not as a voice, but as a cascade of confirmations layered beneath his perception. Systems disengaged. Channels rerouted. External listening nodes dropped one by one. By the time he reached the end of the corridor, humanity was no longer broadcasting its internal state to anyone but itself. That was the second move. The first had been silence. The third waited below. The lift responded before he touched it, recognizing command priority. As it descended, Ilya finally allowed himself to exhale, not out of relief, but out of transition. The shift from public presence to operational control. Above him, the Citadel still believed it was dictating the outcome. That belief would hold for a little while longer. The doors opened into a space most delegations never saw. The human operational core was not large. It was not impressive in the way alien infrastructure often was. No sweeping architecture. No ceremonial design. Just layered consoles, overlapping data streams, and a handful of individuals already moving with precise, contained urgency. They did not look up immediately. That was intentional. Panic looked up. Preparation kept working. Only when Ilya stepped fully into the room did they shift their attention, not to him, but to the change in priority his presence represented. Clara Sen was the first to speak. They went public earlier than expected, she said, her tone flat, analytical. Authorization chain confirms multi-signature approval. Not a procedural breach. A procedural exploit. Ilya nodded once. Timing? 43 days minimum, she replied without hesitation. Possibly longer. They needed alignment across multiple oversight layers. Which meant this had never been about reacting to humanity. It had been about positioning humanity. Ilya moved toward the central console, his gaze flicking across the data streams already compiling. Broadcast permissions. Filing categories. Access logs. Everything the Citadel considered transparent, because it had never expected anyone to question the structure itself. That category they used, Ilya said. The demonstration. Clara's fingers shifted across the interface, pulling up a layered set of documents. Obscure classification, she confirmed. Buried under arbitration subprotocols. It bypasses standard session previews if labeled as non-adversarial. Non-adversarial? Ilya almost smiled. They defined humiliation as non-adversarial. Technically correct, Clara said. There's no direct accusation. Just curated context. That was the elegance of it. No law broken. No rule violated. Just the system used exactly as designed, against someone who hadn't realized it could be. Ilya's gaze shifted to the far console where Marcus Hale was already reconstructing the broadcast chain. They wanted maximum reach, Marcus said without being asked. Full relay saturation. Every major system. No delay buffers. No regional filters. Meaning whatever they're showing, Marcus replied, they wanted it to become the version of us that everyone remembers. Not truth. Not even narrative. Memory. Ilya absorbed that in silence for a moment. Then he asked the question that mattered. What did we miss? The room stilled. Not because they didn't have answers. Because that question meant the phase of observation was over. Now they had to move. Clara was the one who answered. We didn't miss the event, she said. We missed the intent. Ilya didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the secondary interface, the one not connected to the Citadel's shared systems. The one that ran on human architecture, layered quietly beneath years of cooperation. Show me dependency mapping, he said. There was a slight pause. Not hesitation. Recognition. Marcus looked up this time. All layers. All layers, Ilya confirmed. For a fraction of a second, the room held its breath, not out of fear, but because that request meant something very specific. It meant they were no longer treating this as a diplomatic incident. They were treating it as a structural engagement. Marcus initiated the sequence. Data unfolded, not outward but inward. Beneath the visible operations of the Citadel, beneath the arbitration protocols, beneath the legal frameworks that every species trusted because they had always worked. Verification chains. Translation anchors. Archive validation systems. Routing confirmations. Invisible mechanisms that ensured every agreement, every record, every interaction across the galaxy remained consistent and accepted. Most species never thought about them. Humans had built half of them. Quietly. Incrementally. Because someone had to make sure the system worked. And no one else had cared enough to notice how it worked. Until now. Clara's voice dropped slightly, not in secrecy, but in precision. They didn't just humiliate us, she said. They anchored it into the record. Ilya nodded. Then we don't correct the record, he said. He let that sit for a moment, watching the understanding ripple through the room. We change what the record depends on. Silence followed. Not confusion. Calculation. Because that wasn't a defensive move. That was something else entirely. Marcus leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing as the implications settled. If we do that, he said carefully, it won't look like retaliation. No, Ilya replied. It'll look like failure. Ilya met his gaze. Only at first. Another pause. Then Clara asked the question none of them could avoid. And the timeline? Ilya turned his attention back to the central display, where the broadcast indicator still pulsed in steady intervals. They went live without warning, he said, which means they expected us to react inside their window. He shifted the interface, isolating the cycle markers. We don't. He tapped the screen once. We move before the next rotation. Marcus frowned slightly. That's less than a full cycle. Correct. Clara's expression tightened, not in doubt, but in recognition of the scale. That's not enough time to prepare a response, she said. Ilya's gaze didn't leave the display. We're not preparing a response, he said quietly. We're initiating a sequence. That word changed everything. Because a response could be blocked. A sequence, once started, could only be followed. The room came alive then, not with panic, but with focus sharpened to its edge. Channels opened, internal, isolated, secure. Subroutines activated. Requests were not sent outward. They were routed inward, to systems already in place. Because this had not started today. This had started years ago. The only difference was that now, for the first time, they were going to use it. Ilya stepped back from the console as the first confirmations began to appear. One by one. Quiet. Precise. Irreversible. Above them, across the galaxy, the broadcast continued. Unchanged, uninterrupted, still telling its carefully constructed story. But inside the Citadel, something else had begun to move. Something that wasn't visible. Something that didn't argue. Something that didn't ask permission. And as the first layer of that sequence locked into place, Clara looked up again. Not at the data this time, but at Ilya. There's one more thing, she said. He didn't ask what. He already knew from her tone that it mattered. The category they used, she continued. The one that let them bypass the preview. Ilya waited. Clara pulled up a final line of code, buried, overlooked, almost irrelevant. It only works, she said slowly, if the subject doesn't contest jurisdiction. For a moment, no one spoke. Because suddenly, Ilya's silence in the chamber meant something very different. Not surrender. Not restraint. Permission. And if humanity had just allowed the Citadel to define the terms of judgment, then the only question left was, what happens when humans decide to redefine them instead? The first disruption did not look like an attack. That was why no one noticed it. Across the Citadel's outer networks, a minor verification delay appeared in a routine archive request from a mid-tier trade system. Nothing critical, nothing urgent, just a slight lag where there had never been one before. It resolved itself in less than a second. The system logged it, corrected it, and moved on. Then it happened again. And again. Not in the same place. Not in the same sequence. Spread thin across unrelated systems, each instance too small to trigger alarm protocols, each one corrected before escalation. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Inside the human operations core, Marcus Hale watched the signals accumulate with growing focus, his hands moving across the interface in smooth, deliberate arcs as he overlaid system layers most species had never learned to see. They're compensating, he said quietly. Clara didn't look up. Of course they are. That's what the system is designed to do. Marcus nodded once. Yes. But it's compensating for us. That distinction mattered. Because the Citadel's architecture wasn't reacting to failure. It was reacting to absence. Ilya Voss stood behind them, his posture still, his attention fixed not on the anomalies themselves but on the space between them. The intervals. The silence where nothing should have happened, and yet something had. How deep? He asked. Marcus expanded the mapping. Deeper layers unfolded, not the visible diplomatic channels, but the infrastructural scaffolding beneath them. Authentication matrices, translation anchors, cross-species archival validation systems. The quiet machinery that made the galaxy function as if it were coherent. They're feeling it at the foundation level, Marcus said. Not enough to panic. Not enough to trace. But enough to notice. Clara's fingers paused for the first time. Good, she said softly. That means they don't know where to look. Ilya stepped closer, his gaze narrowing slightly as he studied the cascade of responses. The Citadel systems were adapting exactly as designed, redistributing load, rerouting dependencies, reinforcing weakened pathways. It was elegant, efficient, predictable. They built this to survive instability, Ilya said. Clara glanced at him. Every system is built to survive instability. Ilya shook his head once. No, he said. They built it to survive instability, from within the rules. The room went quiet. Because what humanity had started was not instability within the rules. It was pressure outside them. Marcus leaned back slightly, processing the implication. If we push too hard, he said, the system will isolate the failure. And if we don't push hard enough, Clara added, it stabilizes before anything meaningful shifts. Ilya nodded. That's why this isn't pressure, he said. It's sequence. He reached forward, adjusting the overlay to reveal a secondary pattern, one not tied to disruption, but to dependency. Lines of connection lit up across the display. Not between species. Between functions. Navigation verification linked to translation anchors. Translation anchors linked to archival integrity. Archival integrity linked to treaty validation. Each layer resting on the next, forming a structure so interwoven that no single component could be removed without consequences. This is what they don't see, Ilya said quietly. Clara followed the lines, her expression tightening as the pattern resolved. They think power sits at the top, she murmured. Marcus exhaled slowly. But it's held together at the bottom. Ilya didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because they all understood what that meant. Humanity had not been placed at the top of the system. They had been placed beneath it, maintaining it, strengthening it, making sure it worked. And no one had ever questioned what would happen if they stopped. Not entirely. Just enough. Marcus's console chimed softly, an incoming anomaly flag from a secondary system. He pulled it up. This one's different, he said. Clara moved closer. How? Marcus adjusted the parameters, isolating the signal. It didn't correct, he said. Ilya's attention sharpened. Why not? Marcus hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because the answer was unexpected. Because it didn't try to. The words hung in the air. Clara leaned in, scanning the data with increasing intensity. That's not possible, she said under her breath. The system always attempts correction. Unless, Marcus replied slowly, it doesn't recognize the deviation as an error. Ilya's gaze shifted. Or, he said, it recognizes it as something else. Silence followed. Because that possibility opened a different kind of door. Not disruption. Not failure. Reclassification. Clara straightened slightly, her mind already moving ahead. If the system starts reclassifying, she said, then it stops compensating. Marcus's eyes widened just a fraction. And if it stops compensating, it starts adapting, Ilya finished. Not to restore the previous state, but to accommodate the new one. The implications were enormous. Because adaptation meant the system itself would begin to shift, subtly at first, then structurally, without requiring direct force. Without triggering defense protocols. Without revealing the source. Marcus looked at Ilya, a new edge of tension entering his voice. That's not pressure, he said. Ilya met his gaze. No, he replied. It's influence. Clara turned back to her console, already isolating the conditions that had triggered the anomaly. What caused it, she asked. Marcus replayed the sequence, tracing the origin point through layers of abstraction. It lines up with the first withdrawal marker, he said. Clara frowned slightly. We haven't issued any withdrawals yet. Marcus shook his head. No, he said. But the system thinks we have. The room stilled. Because that meant something had changed, not in reality, but in perception. The Citadel's infrastructure was beginning to register humanity's position differently. Not as a compliant participant. Not as a passive subject. But as something undefined. Ilya's expression didn't change. But something behind it did. Good, he said quietly. Clara looked up sharply. Good, she repeated. If the system doesn't know what we are, Ilya said, it can't predict what we'll do. Marcus leaned forward again, his focus intensifying. And if it can't predict? It can't contain, Clara finished. A new alert pulsed across the central display. Not a minor anomaly. Not a corrected delay. A structural notification. Marcus opened it. For a moment he didn't speak. Clara stepped closer. What is it? Marcus swallowed once, not in fear, but in the recognition of scale. It's not an error, he said. Then what is it? He looked at them. It's a query. Ilya's gaze sharpened. From where? Marcus turned the display outward, projecting the source. Not a single system. Not a single species. The Citadel core itself. A request, silent, automatic, embedded deep within the architecture. Triggered by the sequence humanity had begun. The message was simple, but its meaning was not. Clarify status of human delegation. The room fell into complete stillness. Because for the first time since the broadcast began, the system that governed the galaxy was no longer certain what humanity was. And systems that lose certainty do one of two things. They stabilize, or they change. Ilya Voss looked at the query for a long moment, then reached forward and closed the display. Don't answer it, he said. Clara blinked. If we don't respond, it escalates. Ilya nodded once. That's the point. Marcus stared at him. You want the system to keep asking? Ilya turned slightly, his voice calm, precise. I want it to realize it doesn't have an answer. Silence followed. Heavy. Because somewhere above them, beyond the walls of the operations core, beyond the chambers still broadcasting humanity's past to the galaxy, something vast had just begun to hesitate. And hesitation, in a system built on certainty, was not a weakness. It was the beginning of collapse. Or transformation. The only question left was, which one humanity intended to force first? The hesitation did not remain contained. For a system as vast as the Citadel, uncertainty was never supposed to propagate. Every layer had been designed to isolate ambiguity, to absorb it, classify it, and neutralize it before it reached anything critical. That was the strength of the structure, predictability enforced through constant correction. But now, for the first time in its recorded history, the uncertainty had no category. And so, instead of being contained, it spread. It began quietly. A navigation corridor request between two minor trade systems flagged a validation delay, not because the route was unavailable, but because the authentication chain that confirmed its legitimacy returned a conditional status. Not denied. Not approved. Conditional. Moments later, a treaty verification query between three mid-tier species stalled, not from missing data, but from conflicting archival references that should never have conflicted. The system attempted reconciliation, failed, and escalated the request upward. Across the Citadel's network, similar signals began to emerge. Not failures. Questions. And every question traced back, directly or indirectly, to a single variable. Humanity. Inside the chamber, High Curator Thel had not yet reacted publicly. The broadcast still ran, the narrative still unfolded, and the official posture remained composed. But the stillness had changed. Because beneath the performance, the Citadel was beginning to feel something it had not felt in generations. Instability without origin. And systems built on control did not tolerate unknowns. They hunted them. In the human operations core, the shift was immediate. Marcus's display filled with escalating system queries, each one more complex than the last, each one reaching deeper into layers that had never before required direct interrogation. They're moving, he said, voice low but sharp. Clara didn't need clarification. Containment protocols? Marcus nodded. Soft engagement first. Pattern tracing. Source isolation. Ilya watched the progression in silence, his attention not on the volume of activity, but on its direction. They still think this is localized, he said. Clara glanced at him. For now. Marcus pulled up a predictive overlay. That won't last, he added. Once they fail to isolate a source, they'll escalate to structural diagnostics. Clara's expression tightened slightly. That means deep scans. Yes. And if they go deep enough, they'll start seeing us, Marcus finished. The room fell into a brief, heavy quiet. Because this had always been the risk. Humanity had not hacked the system. They had not broken it, infiltrated it, or overridden it. They had simply withdrawn just enough of their unseen contributions to create imbalance. But imbalance left traces. And if the Citadel looked deeply enough, it would begin to understand where those traces led. Ilya's gaze shifted across the data, his mind moving several steps ahead. How long? He asked. Marcus didn't hesitate. Less than a cycle. Clara exhaled slowly. That's not enough time to complete the sequence. Ilya shook his head. We don't need to complete it, he said. We need to advance it. Clara turned toward him fully now. That increases exposure. Yes. It also increases risk of containment. Yes. And if they contain it early, they confirm the system is vulnerable, Ilya said calmly. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded. Because that was the trade. Not safety. Momentum. Marcus adjusted the overlays, isolating the next phase triggers. If we push the second layer now, he said, it accelerates the reclassification cascade. Clara frowned slightly. That also means the system starts prioritizing resolution over stability. Marcus looked at her. Exactly. And that was the turning point. Because a system focused on stability absorbed disruption. A system focused on resolution changed itself to eliminate the cause. Ilya stepped closer to the console. Then we force resolution, he said. Marcus's fingers hovered over the interface. Once we trigger this, he warned, there's no rollback. Ilya didn't look away from the display. There never was. The command executed. It did not feel like a surge. There was no dramatic shift, no visible collapse, no cascading failure. Just a quiet adjustment. Across the Citadel, systems began to reinterpret their own data. Authentication chains re-evaluated dependency hierarchies. Archival systems flagged inconsistencies not as errors, but as structural deviations. Translation anchors recalibrated contextual frameworks, altering how meaning itself was preserved across species. Individually, each change was minor. Collectively, they began to rewrite the logic the Citadel used to understand itself. And that was when the first real response came. Not from the system. From the people who controlled it. In the chamber above, Fel paused mid-sentence. It was subtle, so subtle most observers would miss it. But for a being that had mastered the art of uninterrupted control, even a fraction of a second was noticeable. Because something had interrupted the flow. Not externally. Internally. A signal, routed through priority channels, bypassing standard filters. Fel did not acknowledge it immediately. That would have broken the narrative. Instead, they finished the sentence, allowed the broadcast to continue for several more seconds, and then raised a single limb toward the chamber's control interface. Pause transmission, Fel said. The words echoed through the Citadel. And for the first time since the feed had gone live, the broadcast stopped. Across the galaxy, billions of viewers were left staring at frozen images of a humanity that no longer moved, no longer explained itself, no longer reacted. Silence replaced narrative. And silence invited questions. Inside the chamber, tension surged, not loudly, not chaotically, but in a dense, layered wave as delegations began to communicate in rapid, overlapping signals. Because something had changed. The performance had broken. Fel turned slightly, conferring with an aide in a low, rapid exchange that carried none of the earlier composure. That was new. That was important. In the operations core, Marcus stared at the chamber feed. They weren't supposed to stop the broadcast, he said. Clara's eyes narrowed. They didn't choose to. Ilya's gaze sharpened. Show me. Marcus pulled up the interruption log. A priority override had been triggered, not by Thel, not by any visible authority, but by the system itself. A procedural safeguard. Activated when internal consistency dropped below a certain threshold. Clara's voice dropped. The system forced the pause. Marcus nodded slowly. And now they know something's wrong. Ilya watched the frozen image on the screen, the final frame of humanity's curated past, suspended in perfect stillness. They don't just know something's wrong, he said quietly. They know it's systemic. Above them, in the chamber, Thel straightened, composure reasserting itself with visible effort. The Citadel is addressing a temporary procedural inconsistency, they announced. All delegations are requested to remain in session while diagnostic protocols are completed. The wording was precise, controlled, but the damage was done, because the Citadel had just admitted, to every species present, and to every system watching, that its own structure was not behaving as expected. And once that belief entered the room, it could not be removed. Marcus turned back to Ilya. They're escalating, he said. Full diagnostics incoming. Clara's fingers moved again, faster now. If they trace the deviations, they won't find a breach, Ilya said. They'll find a dependency. Clara stopped. Slowly she looked up at him. And when they do? Ilya's expression didn't change. They'll realize something they've never had to consider before. Marcus leaned forward. What? Ilya's voice was calm. That the system they control doesn't belong entirely to them. Silence settled over the room. Heavy. Because above them, across the Citadel, across the galaxy, the questions were multiplying. The structure was shifting. And for the first time since humanity had entered the interstellar stage, power was no longer sitting where everyone thought it was. The only problem was, once the Citadel understood that truth, it would not respond quietly. The Citadel did not panic. It adapted. That was what made it dangerous. Within moments of the broadcast halt, the Arbitration Corps initiated a cascade of containment diagnostics, layered, methodical, and deeply embedded. Entire segments of the infrastructure shifted into analysis mode, rerouting authority channels, isolating anomalies, and cross-referencing every inconsistency against historical baselines. From the outside, it looked like control being reasserted. From the inside, it was something else entirely. A system searching for something it could no longer define. In the Human Operations Core, the change was immediate. Marcus's display surged with incoming data, not chaotic, not overwhelming, but organized in a way that made it far more unsettling. The Citadel wasn't reacting blindly. It was narrowing in. They've escalated past surface diagnostics, he said, voice tight with focus. They're mapping dependency chains. Clara's hands moved faster, isolating layers as they shifted. That means they're not looking for a breach anymore, she said. They're looking for influence. Ilya Voss stood at the center of the room, still as ever, watching the system do exactly what he had expected it to do. Good, he said quietly. Marcus glanced back at him. Good. If they look for a breach, Ilya replied, they find nothing. If they look for influence, Clara finished the thought. They find us. A silence followed. Not fear. Recognition. Because that was the pivot point. Up until now, humanity had been invisible within the structure, present, essential, but unacknowledged. The system had depended on them without ever needing to identify them. That was no longer true. Now the Citadel was beginning to see the pattern. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Marcus expanded the core overlay, revealing the shifting network in real time. Lines of authority, validation, and confirmation began to rearrange themselves, not collapsing, not failing, but reorienting around the inconsistencies humanity had introduced. They're rebalancing, he said, trying to redistribute dependency. Clara leaned closer, her expression sharpening. They can't, she said. Not fully. Why not? Because the dependencies aren't modular, she replied. They're layered. Remove one, And you don't just lose function, you lose trust. That was the flaw. The one no one had ever bothered to consider. The Citadel did not run on power. It ran on agreement. Agreement that data was valid. Agreement that translations were accurate. Agreement that records were authentic. And every one of those agreements had, over time, passed through human systems. Not because humanity had demanded it, because humanity had made it easier, better, reliable, until it became standard, until it became invisible, until it became indispensable. Marcus's console chimed again, this time not with an anomaly, but with a classification update. He froze for a fraction of a second before opening it. They've reclassified us, he said. Clara turned sharply. How? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. He projected the classification outward. Humanity, non-stable variable within arbitration framework. The words hung in the air. Ilya studied them without reaction. Non-stable, Clara repeated under her breath. They don't know what we are, Marcus said. So they've labeled us as something that can't be predicted. Clara's gaze shifted to Ilya. That's not containment, she said slowly. No, Ilya replied. It's escalation. Because once something was labeled non-stable, the Citadel had protocols. Not for negotiation. For correction. Marcus swallowed once. They're moving to corrective authority layers, he said. That means direct intervention. Clara's fingers tightened slightly on the console. They're going to try to force alignment, she said. On us. On the system, she clarified. And anything causing deviation becomes removable. The implication landed hard. Not an attack. Not war. Erasure. Procedural. Justified within the framework. Ilya's expression didn't change. They won't do it publicly, he said. Marcus shook his head. No. But they'll isolate us. Cut access. Reassign dependencies. Make it look like we were never critical in the first place. Clara exhaled slowly. They'll rewrite the system to exclude us. Silence settled again. Heavy. Because that was the counterplay. Not confrontation. Replacement. If the Citadel could remove humanity's influence without exposing the gap it created, then everything humanity had just done would vanish beneath a new layer of controlled stability. They wouldn't be defeated. They would be erased from relevance. Marcus looked at Ilya, tension rising for the first time. If they start cutting us out, we lose leverage. Ilya finally moved. Just a step forward. Just enough to shift the balance in the room. They can't cut us out fast enough, he said. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. Not unless we let them, she said. Ilya nodded once. Exactly. He reached for the central interface, bringing up a sequence Clara and Marcus both recognized, but had not expected to use yet. Clara's voice dropped. That's not part of the initial plan. No, Ilya said calmly. It's the midpoint. Marcus stared at the sequence. That accelerates everything, he said. If we trigger this now, we don't just influence the system, we force it to respond in real time. Clara added quietly, and we expose ourselves completely. Ilya met their gaze. They're already looking, he said. The pause. Then Clara asked the question that mattered most. And the cost? Ilya didn't hesitate. We lose the option to step back. Marcus exhaled slowly. No fallback. No reversal. Clara held his gaze. And if this doesn't work? Ilya's voice remained steady. Then we become exactly what they just classified us as. Non-stable. Unpredictable. Uncontainable. The room fell silent again. Because that wasn't a threat. It was a line. And once crossed, there would be no returning to what humanity had been before. Marcus looked at the display one last time. Then he nodded. Clara followed. Not out of certainty. Out of understanding. Ilya initiated the sequence. This time, the system didn't hesitate. It reacted. Across the Citadel, dependency layers shifted simultaneously, not gradually, not subtly, but in a synchronized recalibration that no longer resembled passive adaptation. Verification chains began rerouting through alternate pathways. Translation anchors started cross-referencing independent validation sources. Archival systems flagged entire segments for re-authentication. The structure didn't break. It questioned itself. At scale, in the chamber above, Fel felt it immediately. Not as an error, as resistance. Their connection to the Citadel core flickered, not in strength but in certainty. Commands still executed, systems still responded, but the seamless alignment that had always existed between authority and outcome wavered. For the first time, the Citadel was not simply obeying. It was evaluating. Fel's posture shifted, just slightly, but enough for those watching closely to notice. Because something had changed. Not in the system. In control. Back in the operations core, Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. "They can't stabilize this," he said. Clara nodded slowly. Not without exposing the gaps. Ilya watched the cascade unfold, his gaze steady. "That's the point." Marcus turned toward him. And when they realized that? Ilya didn't look away from the display. They already have. Above them, in the chamber, Fel straightened fully, abandoning the pretense of passive control. "All delegations," Fel said, voice resonating with sharpened authority, "the Citadel is entering priority correction protocol. Remain in position." The words carried power, but something beneath them had changed. Because this time, the system did not respond immediately. And in that fraction of delay, in that single, impossible hesitation, every species in the chamber felt it. The shift. The realization that the structure they had trusted without question was no longer entirely under control. And as that realization spread, not as panic but as awareness, one truth began to settle across the Citadel, across the watching galaxy, deeper than any broadcast could carry. Humanity had not defended itself. It had moved the foundation. The only question now was, when the structure finished adjusting, what would still be standing on top of it? The Citadel had faced instability before. Localized disputes, trade collapses, even interspecies conflicts that threatened to fracture entire regions. But every one of those crises had shared a common trait. They existed within the system. This did not. This was the system itself, beginning to question its own continuity. And once that process started, there was no clean way to stop it. Across the arbitration layers, priority correction protocols accelerated into full execution. Entire validation hierarchies were being rewritten in real time, with authority nodes cross-checking each other in loops that had never been designed to run simultaneously. What had once been a streamlined structure of trust was now a web of recursive verification. Nothing was breaking, but nothing was flowing cleanly anymore either. Requests slowed, not stopped, just delayed enough to be noticed. Confirmations returned with secondary checks attached. Translation outputs began including context qualifiers that had never been necessary before. The system wasn't failing. It was doubting. Inside the human operations core, Marcus leaned forward, eyes scanning the expanding cascade of responses. "They've moved past containment," he said. "This is full systemic interrogation." Clara didn't look up from her console. "They're forcing the system to justify every assumption it makes," she replied. "Every agreement, every record, every classification." Marcus exhaled sharply. "That's not sustainable." "No," Clara said quietly. "It isn't." Ilya Voss stood at the center of it all, watching the shift unfold with a calm that felt almost out of place against the rising pressure. "Then they won't sustain it," he said. Marcus glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "They'll try to resolve it," Ilya answered. "Quickly." Clara's hand slowed for just a fraction of a second. "That means decisive action," she said. Marcus nodded. "And decisive action, in this system, means authority override." A silence followed. Because authority override was not subtle. It was the Citadel asserting control directly, forcing alignment rather than negotiating it through layers of process. "And if that happened, they'll choose a point of failure," Clara said slowly. Marcus's voice dropped. "And remove it." Both of them turned toward Ilya. Because there was only one variable that made sense. Humanity. Ilya met their gaze without hesitation. Yes, he said. They will. The words did not carry fear. Only certainty. Because this had always been the moment that mattered. Not the humiliation. Not the disruption. The point where the system stopped adapting and started choosing. Marcus's console pulsed again, this time with a priority level notification. He opened it, his expression tightening. It's happening, he said. Clara stepped closer. What kind of action? Marcus projected the data outward. Authority layer directive, reassignment of validation dependencies. Clara's breath caught, not in panic, but in realization. They're rerouting core functions away from us, she said, trying to replace our systems with internal redundancies. Marcus nodded grimly. If they succeed, we lose our position in the architecture. And if we lose that, Clara added, everything we've done collapses into a temporary anomaly. The system would stabilize. The narrative would reset. Humanity would become irrelevant again. Ilya stepped forward. Not fast enough, he said. Marcus frowned. You've said that before. But they're not trying to be subtle anymore. They're forcing the shift. Exactly, Ilya replied. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. They're exposing themselves. Ilya nodded. In order to replace us, they have to reveal where we were. The room stilled. Because that was the hidden cost of the Citadel's move. For generations, its authority had appeared seamless, neutral, absolute, unquestioned. But now, in its attempt to remove humanity from the system, it was being forced to highlight the very dependencies it had never acknowledged. Marcus leaned back slightly, the realization settling in. They're showing everyone where the system was relying on us, he said. And how much, Clara added. Across the chamber above, that truth was already beginning to surface. Delegations were no longer watching passively. Conversations had broken out, quiet at first, then layered, overlapping, building into something far more dangerous than noise. Awareness. Because as the Citadel rerouted its own structure, gaps appeared, brief, flickering moments where processes slowed or shifted just enough for observers to notice. Trade confirmations delayed. Translation outputs altered. Archive references flagged for revalidation. Individually, each change was minor. Collectively, they formed a pattern. A pattern that pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. The system had not been as self-contained as everyone believed. And someone had been holding it together. Back in the operations core, Clara's console flashed with a new alert. She opened it, her expression sharpening instantly. They're targeting external perception now, she said. Marcus looked over. Meaning? Clara expanded the data. They're pushing a narrative correction through secondary channels, she said. Framing the instability as a result of human interference. Marcus let out a short breath. So now we're the problem. We always were, Clara replied. Now they're just saying it out loud. Ilya's gaze didn't shift. Let them, he said. Marcus blinked. That helps them. For a moment, Ilya said. Clara's eyes flicked toward him. You're counting on something, she said. I'm counting on consistency, he replied. Marcus frowned. Consistency of what? Ilya finally turned slightly, his voice calm but precise. If we were the problem, he said, removing us would fix it. The pause. Clara's expression changed. And it won't. No, Ilya said. It won't. Because the system was no longer reacting to humanity's presence. It was reacting to humanity's absence. And that difference would become impossible to hide. Marcus leaned forward again, watching the cascading data streams. They're accelerating, he said. If they push this any further, they risk destabilizing core arbitration functions. Clara nodded slowly. They won't stop, she said. Not until they think they've regained control. Ilya looked back at the display. They won't regain it, he said quietly. The certainty in his voice didn't come from arrogance. It came from understanding. Because the Citadel had made its choice. It had moved to remove humanity. And in doing so, it had committed to a path that required proving humanity was unnecessary. A claim that reality was already beginning to contradict. Above them, in the chamber, Fel stood at the center of a structure that was no longer responding with perfect alignment. Commands executed, but with delay. Systems complied, but with verification. For the first time, authority was being checked. Not challenged. Not denied. Just questioned. And in a system built on unquestioned control, that was more dangerous than open rebellion. Back in the operations core, Marcus's voice dropped to a near whisper. "They're reaching the threshold," he said. Clara didn't need to ask what he meant, because they could all see it. The point where the system could no longer maintain both stability and correction at the same time. It would have to choose, and whatever it chose would define the outcome. Ilya Voss stood perfectly still as the data converged, as the Citadel strained against its own design, as the entire structure edged toward a decision it had never been forced to make before. Then quietly he said, "Now we find out who the system trusts more." A final alert pulsed across the central display. Not a diagnostic. Not a correction. A priority arbitration trigger. The Citadel itself had initiated a formal review of its own authority structure. Clara stared at it. "That's not possible," she said. Marcus didn't respond, because they were both looking at the same thing. The system had escalated beyond its creators. It was no longer asking how to fix the problem. It was asking whether the structure that defined the problem was valid at all. And once a system begins to question its own authority, there is no guarantee it will preserve it. The only question left was, when the judgment came, who would it decide had been holding the galaxy together all along? The moment the arbitration trigger activated, the Citadel changed. Not visibly, not structurally, but in something far more profound, the direction of its authority. For as long as any species could remember, the arbitration citadel had been the source of judgment. Disputes came to it. Evidence was presented to it. Decisions flowed outward from it like gravity, shaping the behavior of entire civilizations. Now, for the first time in its history, the citadel had turned that process inward. It was no longer judging others. It was judging itself. The chamber felt it instantly. The layered conversations that had been building collapsed into a dense, uneasy silence, as if every delegation understood, on some instinctive level, that whatever came next would not be routine. This was not a procedural delay. This was not a temporary correction. This was a foundational question. And once asked, it could not be withdrawn. At the center of the chamber, High Curator Thel stood perfectly still, their composure intact, but their stillness no longer conveyed control. It conveyed calculation. Because this was the moment where authority either reasserted itself or fractured. The arbitration core has initiated a priority review, Thel said, voice resonating through the chamber with deliberate steadiness. All delegations will remain in position while the evaluation proceeds. The words were precise, controlled, but they lacked something they had always carried before. Finality. Because now, the outcome was no longer being declared. It was being determined. Across the chamber, delegations shifted, not physically, but in posture, in attention, in alignment. Some leaned toward each other, exchanging rapid signals. Others withdrew into stillness, observing. A few, very few, turned their attention not to Thel, but to the empty seat where the human envoy had been. Because the question forming across the chamber was no longer subtle. If the system was being reviewed, then what role had humanity actually been playing inside it? Back in the human operations core, the atmosphere had tightened to a razor edge. No one spoke for several seconds after the arbitration trigger appeared, because they all understood what it meant. Marcus was the first to break the silence. That wasn't part of any known protocol, he said. Clara shook her head slowly. It's not a protocol, she replied. It's a fallback. Marcus frowned. Fallback for what? Clara's gaze didn't leave the display. For when the system can't reconcile its own authority. The words settled heavily, because that meant the Citadel had reached a point where it could no longer resolve the contradictions internally. It had to evaluate the structure itself. Marcus leaned forward, scanning the incoming data. It's pulling everything, he said. Every validation chain, every archival record, every dependency layer. Clara's voice dropped. And every influence. They both turned toward Ilya. Because there was no longer any ambiguity. Humanity was no longer hidden within the system. It was now part of the evaluation. Ilya stood where he had been from the beginning, calm, composed, watching the convergence of forces he had set in motion. They're not just reviewing the system, Marcus said quietly. They're reviewing us. Ilya nodded once. Yes. Clara's expression sharpened. That means everything becomes visible, she said. Every contribution, every dependency, every inconsistency. The pause. And every compromise. The room went still. Because that was the risk they had known was coming. Humanity had not been perfect within the system. They had adapted. Adjusted. At times, accepted structures they did not fully agree with, because it allowed them to remain inside, to build, to learn. And now, all of that would be laid bare. Marcus exhaled slowly. They're going to see where we benefited, he said. Clara nodded. And where we didn't push back. Silence followed. Because that could break them. Not technically. Not strategically. But morally. If the Citadel framed humanity not as a stabilizing force, but as a participant in the same flawed structure they were now exposing, the entire narrative could shift. From disruptor of injustice to opportunist of convenience. Marcus looked at Ilya, tension finally breaking through. If they turn that against us, they will, Ilya said calmly. Clara stepped closer. Then what's the move? She asked. For the first time since the sequence had begun, Ilya did not answer immediately. Not because he didn't know. Because this was the point where the plan stopped being purely strategic and became something else. He stepped forward, toward the central interface. Not to hide data, not to filter outputs, but to access the core submission layer that connected directly to the arbitration process. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. You're not going to... Yes, Ilya said. Clara's voice sharpened. That's not required, she said. The system will pull what it needs. And interpret it however it wants, Ilya replied. The pause. Then he added quietly, or we define it first. The room went silent, because that choice carried weight far beyond tactics. It meant not waiting to be judged. It meant stepping forward, before the system decided what humanity was. Marcus stared at him. You're going to submit? He asked. Ilya nodded. Everything relevant. Clara's expression tightened. That includes the compromises, she said. Yes. The moments we chose access over confrontation. Yes. The times we let the system stand, because it was easier. Ilya met her gaze. Yes. Silence followed. Heavy. Because that wasn't a defense. It wasn't even a justification. It was exposure. Voluntary. Complete. Marcus shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief. That's not strategy, he said. Ilya's voice remained steady. It is, he said. Just not the kind they expect. Clara studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly she nodded. Because she understood. The Citadel was built on controlled narratives. On curated truths. On carefully framed authority. If humanity tried to defend itself within that structure, it would be shaped. Defined. Limited. But if humanity removed the ability to frame them, if they presented the full picture, flaws and all, then the system would be forced to evaluate reality, not interpretation. Marcus exhaled, tension shifting into something sharper. Once we do this, he said, there's no controlling the outcome. Ilya nodded. There never was. He initiated the submission. Data flowed, not as a defense, not as a counterargument, but as a complete record. Contributions, dependencies, integrations, and compromises. Every point where humanity had strengthened the system, and every point where they had allowed it to remain flawed. No omissions. No edits. No narrative. Just truth. In the chamber above, the effect was immediate. Delegations began receiving fragments of the arbitration input, not all at once, not in full, but enough to recognize the scope. The human record was not curated. It was exposed. And that changed everything. Because suddenly, the question was no longer, is humanity flawed? That had already been answered. The question became, who wasn't? Thel felt it. Not as loss of control, as loss of framing. Because the narrative that had been constructed, the clean, controlled depiction of human instability, was dissolving under the weight of something far more difficult to dismiss. Context. Complexity. Reality. The system continued its evaluation, pulling in data, cross-referencing, recalculating. And for the first time, it was not being guided. Back in the operations core, Marcus watched the convergence reach critical density. It's almost there, he said. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. When it resolves. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Because they all knew what came next. The Citadel would decide. Not through debate. Not through influence. Through its own logic. And whatever conclusion it reached, would redefine the balance of power across the galaxy. Ilya Voss stood at the center of it all, unmoving, as the system he had helped build, stabilize, and now challenge approached its answer. No more moves. No more adjustments. No more control. Only outcome. And as the arbitration core began its final convergence, as every layer of authority, dependency, and truth collapsed into a single point of decision, one final uncertainty remained, hanging over everything. When the system finished judging itself, would it preserve the structure that had controlled it? Or the species that had been quietly holding it together all along? The Citadel did not announce its decision. It revealed it. There was no dramatic signal, no singular declaration that echoed across the chamber. Instead, the shift unfolded in a series of precise, undeniable changes, small at first, almost imperceptible, but cascading outward with a clarity that no one present could mistake. The arbitration core resolved, and reality adjusted to match it. Across every system linked to the Citadel, validation chains began to stabilize, not by restoring their previous state, but by reconfiguring themselves into something new. Translation anchors recalibrated without distortion. Archive systems aligned without contradiction. Trade verifications resumed, but not along the same pathways they had followed before. The structure had not collapsed. It had rebalanced. And at the center of that rebalancing, one truth became impossible to ignore. Humanity had not been removed. It had been integrated. Fully. Explicitly. For the first time since entering the interstellar stage, humanity's role within the system was no longer hidden beneath layers of quiet contribution. It was visible, defined, acknowledged not as a variable to be managed, but as a foundational component of the Citadel's operational logic. The chamber felt it before anyone spoke. A subtle shift in alignment. Delegations adjusting not in reaction, but in recognition. The quiet understanding that the structure they had trusted had just redefined itself, and in doing so, had redefined where power truly resided. High Curator Thel remained at the center, but the space around them no longer carried the same weight. Authority still existed. Positions still held meaning. But something had changed beneath it, something that could not be undone by posture or precision. Because authority, now, was no longer absolute. It was contextual. And context had expanded. Thel spoke at last. The arbitration core has concluded its review, they said, voice steady, controlled, but lacking the seamless certainty it had once carried. The Citadel acknowledges structural inconsistencies within its prior framework and initiates immediate realignment protocols. The pause. Measured. Deliberate. Humanity is recognized as an active stabilizing agent within the arbitration system. All prior classification parameters are hereby invalidated. The words landed with quiet force. Not applause. Not shock. Something deeper. Acceptance. Because this was not a victory declared. It was a truth uncovered. Across the chamber, the reaction was not uniform, but it was telling. Some delegations shifted in visible relief. Others recalibrated, already considering the implications. A few remained perfectly still, processing what it meant for their own positions within a system that had just proven it could change without their consent. And that was the real outcome. Not dominance. Not defeat. transformation. Back in the human operations core, no one spoke for several seconds after the confirmation came through. Marcus stared at the stabilized data streams, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and understanding. They didn't just stop it, he said quietly. They rebuilt around it. Clara nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the same flow of information. They had to, she said. There was no version of the system that worked without us. The pause. Then she added, softer, not anymore. Ilya Voss said nothing. He didn't need to, because this had never been about forcing recognition. It had been about making recognition unavoidable. He turned from the console and moved toward the corridor, the same path he had taken when he left the chamber hours before. The movement was calm, unhurried, no different from before. But everything around it had changed. As he walked, the citadel felt different. Not in structure. In presence. The quiet hum of its systems carried a new weight, not of control, but of adjustment. The endless flow of data, of decisions, of interactions between species, now moved through a framework that had been altered at its core. Not broken. Not replaced. Refined. When the chamber doors opened, the shift became visible. Conversations slowed. Attention redirected. Not commanded. Chosen. Ilya stepped back into the same space where humanity had been publicly reduced to its worst moments, and for a brief, almost imperceptible instant, the memory of that broadcast lingered. The frozen images. The curated narrative. The expectation of submission. It was still there, but it no longer defined anything, because what followed it had rewritten its meaning. Fell turned to face him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, with precise restraint, Fell inclined their head, not deeply, not ceremonially, but enough to signal acknowledgement. Commander Voss, they said. The Citadel recognizes the outcome. Ilya met their gaze. The Citadel recognized itself, he replied. A flicker of something, difficult to name, impossible to ignore, passed through Thel's posture. Not agreement. Not opposition. Understanding. Because the truth was unavoidable. This had never been about humanity proving its worth. It had been about exposing the limits of a system that believed it could define worth without consequence. The chamber remained quiet as Ilya returned to his place. No celebration followed. No dramatic conclusion. Just a steady, collective awareness that something fundamental had shifted. And that shift would ripple outward, through every agreement, every alliance, every assumption that had once gone unquestioned. Later, in the quieter corridors beyond the chamber, the Citadel resumed its rhythm. Delegations moved, communications resumed, systems flowed, yet beneath it all, the change remained. Because once a structure learns it is not complete, it cannot return to believing it is. Ilya paused at the observation window overlooking the vast curvature of the station. Beyond it, stars stretched in silent, indifferent brilliance, unchanged by what had just occurred, yet somehow witnessing it all the same. Clara joined him a moment later. It worked, she said. Ilya didn't look away from the stars. It aligned, he replied. Marcus arrived shortly after, leaning against the frame with a quiet exhale. They're already adjusting agreements, he said. Re-evaluating dependencies. There's going to be a lot of recalibration. Clara allowed herself a small, tired smile. There always is. A pause settled between them. Not heavy. Not tense. Just complete. Marcus broke it first. You know, he said, they're going to spend a long time trying to figure out when this started. Clara glanced at Ilya. And? Ilya's gaze remained fixed on the stars. They already know, he said quietly. Marcus frowned slightly. They do. Ilya nodded. When we stopped trying to fit into the system they built, he said, and started understanding the one that actually existed. Silence followed. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because the answer had already been given. Humanity had not risen through force. Not through dominance. Not through perfection. But through something far more difficult to ignore. Consistency. Understanding. And the refusal to remain smaller than it truly was. Behind them, the Citadel continued its endless motion, refined, adjusted, still imperfect, but no longer unquestioned. Ahead of them, the galaxy stretched outward, vast, uncertain, filled with systems and structures that had yet to be challenged. And for the first time since humanity had stepped into that larger stage, they were not being measured by it. They were helping define it. Ilya turned from the window. There was more to do. There always would be. And as he walked back into the quiet, relentless flow of work that waited beyond, one truth remained, steady and undeniable. Humanity had not changed the galaxy overnight. They had simply stopped pretending they were smaller than it. And that had been enough.